Okay, so the first bone we'll be doing today is the clavicle. The clavicle, there's specific features about the clavicle. It is a horizontally lying bone. The function of this bone is to transmit the weight of the upper limb towards the sternum. Now if you focus on the bone, this is an S-shaped bone. This bone has three parts, being a shaft and two ends. So one end has to be a medial end and the other one has to be a lateral end, on the basis of which we will decide which side this bone belongs to. Either it's the right side or the left side. Now as we said, this bone has three parts, being the two ends and a shaft. Now when we talk about the lateral end of the bone, the surface of the lateral end of the bone is comparatively flat. So if you see the two sides, this is the flatter end. So this is the lateral side, whereas on the medial side there is a quadrangular structure. So that means the bone's lateral side is this part and the medial side is this part with a shaft in the middle. Another feature is that the lateral end of the bone is concave, whereas the medial end of the bone is convex. So that makes, if we divide the bone into two parts, 2/3 of the bone is convex, 1/3 of the bone is concave. So this bone is being divided into two parts, being the lateral and the medial end. Now we know this is the lateral part and we know this is the medial part. Also with that, we have two surfaces of the bone, being the superior and the inferior surface. Now the superior surface is comparatively smooth as compared to the inferior surface. So let's see, this is a comparatively smoother surface, and when we turn it to the other side, this is a comparatively rough surface. As I said, one of the features of this bone is that on the lateral side of the bone, on the inferior surface, we have two different features, being the conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge at the lateral end. Whereas in the middle there is a groove which is called as the subclavian groove. That means this is the lower end of the bone and the upper end. So we'll keep the bone this way, lateral end towards here and the medial end towards here. The medial end is attached to the sternum. This makes the bone of the right side. Now when we've determined the side, we need to move on with the attachments. The lateral end of the bone, or the lateral 1/3 of the bone, is divided into two surfaces and two borders, being the anterior border and the posterior border, and the superior and the inferior border, inferior surface, superior and the inferior surface, anterior and posterior border. This is the lateral 1/3, whereas the medial 2/3 is comparatively circular or round in structure, having four surfaces only, being the anterior, posterior, superior and inferior surface. Now let's move with the attachments. On the lateral 1/3 at the anterior border, there is origin of the deltoid muscle. I repeat, origin. When we talk about attachments, it's either an insertion or an origin. So at the anterior border of the lateral end of the clavicle is the origin of the deltoid muscle, whereas at the posterior border is the insertion of the trapezius muscle. Now when we turn the bone around and we look at the inferior surface, we have the conoid tubercle and the trapezius ridge, the trapezoid ridge, the trapezoid ridge, the conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge. This gives attachment to the coracoclavicular ligament. Okay, and we move towards the medial end now. It has four surfaces: anterior, posterior, superior and inferior. I repeat, anterior, posterior, superior and inferior. Now at the anterior surface, there is origin of the pectoralis major muscle. On the posterior surface, there is origin of the sternohyoid muscle. So pectoralis major and the sternohyoid muscle. Now The superior surface has a little bit of rough structure in here, and this will give origin to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, or the clavicular head of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now moving towards the inferior surface, we see a oval shaped structure over here. It's a roughness, and over here it gives attachment to the costoclavicular ligament. Now if you focus on the bone, the inferior surface of the bone is giving attachment to two ligaments only. There has been no muscular attachment. The ligament on the medial end at the oval impression is the attachment for the costoclavicular ligament, whereas at the lateral end on the conoid and the trapezius ridge, there is attachment of the coracoclavicular ligament. There is attachment of the coracoclavicular ligament, and on the oval shape is the costoclavicular ligament. I repeat, at the lower end we have attachments of two ligaments. The oval impression on the medial side gives attachment to costoclavicular. On the medial side it gives attachment to the coracoclavicular ligament, which is from covering the conoid tubercle as well as the trapezoid ridge. In the middle is a groove called the subclavian groove, which gives attachment to the subclavius muscle. The next we're going to study is the scapula, which is also called as the shoulder blade. Now if you look at the specific features of the bone, this bone is divided into four parts, that is 3 borders, 3 angles, 3 processes and 2 surfaces. I repeat, there's 3 borders, 3 angles, 3 processes and 2 surfaces. First of all, we need to know is the side determination. The first thing we need to know about the side determination is that this part or this cavity is called as the glenoid cavity, which is the lateral most part of the bone. That means this comes on the outer end. Along with that, the bone is divided into 2 surfaces, which is called as the costal and the dorsal surface. The dorsal surface is convex, the costal surface is concave. Let me show you another bone. This is a comparatively convex structure, which is called as a dorsal surface. On the inner side is a concave structure, which is called as a costal surface. Now the dorsal surface is divided into 2 parts by a structure which is called as the spine of the scapula. So the spine of the scapula is dividing the dorsal surface into 2 parts, being the supraspinous and the intraspinous fossa. On the contrary, the costal surface, there are no particular divisions, and this area is called as the subscapular fossa. Also, as I said, this is the glenoid cavity, which is the lateral most structure. This is followed by a thick border, which is called as the lateral border. So if we place the bone, this being the dorsal surface, this being the costal surface, this is the bone of the right side. This is how you place, this is the body, and this is the bone of the right side. Now, moving with the particular features, there was a dorsal surface, a costal surface, the glenoid cavity. The dorsal surface had a spine, which was dividing the surface into 2 fossas, being the supraspinous and the infraspinous fossa. These 2 are connected by a glenoid notch. If you see, a spinoglenoid notch. The fossas are connected via the spinoglenoid notch. Moving on next, we've talked about the 2 surfaces. Now we'll move with the 3 borders. This bone has 3 borders: superior border, lateral border, and a medial border. The medial border is thin and extends from the superior angle towards the inferior angle. The lateral border is thick, with the lateral border giving you a feel of a rod-like structure. extending below the glenoid cavity all the way towards the inferior angle. Then comes the superior border, which is very thin and short. This is going to present a notch over here, that is, you go smooth and you go towards a notch, which is called as the suprascapular notch. So this was the dorsal surface. The dorsal surface was divided into two parts by the spine. It had superiorly a supraspinous fossa, inferiorly an intraspinous fossa, and the two fossas were connected via a spinoglenoid notch. And this is the superior border, which is going towards a suprascapular notch. So we have two notches here, suprascapular and the spinoglenoid notch. So far we've talked about the features of the shoulder blade or the features of the scapula. This bone is divided into four parts, being two surfaces, three borders, three angles, and three processes. Now, first of all, we will do the slight determination. The lateral part of the bone is represented by the glenoid cavity, followed by a thick rod-like structure forming the lateral border. Then we have two surfaces, being the dorsal surface and the costal surface. The dorsal surface features included a spine, which was dividing the surface into two parts, being the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa, which are connected to each other by a notch, which is called as the spinoglenoid notch. Moving towards the costal surface had a fossa, which is called as the This is called as the subscapular fossa. It is concave, whereas the dorsal surface is convex. Then we said that it has three borders. The lateral border, which is thick and rod-like. The medial border, which is thin, extending from the superior angle towards the inferior angle. And we had the superior border, which is another thin border, moving towards the supraspinous notch. Now we move towards the angle. So we had a superior angle, inferior angle, and a lateral or the glenoid angle. It has a glenoid cavity. Moving on next, we've talked about two surfaces, being the costal and the dorsal surface, three angles, superior, inferior, and lateral angle. And we've talked about three borders, being the superior, medial, and lateral border. Now we'll move with the three processes of the bone. This is the spinous, which is dividing the dorsal surface into two parts, is called as the crest of the spine, and this is the spinous process. This goes all the way towards forming the acromion process, and behind the acromion process is the coracoid process. This is like a beak. I repeat, on the dorsal surface we have the spinous process, also called as the crest of the spine. This is the acromion process, and behind it is the coracoid process. This is the lateral border. This is the glenoid cavity. Below the glenoid cavity is a tubercle, which is called as the infraglenoid tubercle. So before moving towards the attachments, I will revise the bone again. This is the shoulder blade or the scapula bone. First of all, we need to determine which side this bone belongs to. So we know that at the lateral end is the glenoid cavity. This makes the lateral end of the bone. This bone is divided into four parts, being three borders, three angles, three processes, and two surfaces. We have two surfaces being the costal and the dorsal surface. On the dorsal surface there is a crest, or there's a spinous process which divides this surface into two cavities or two fossas, being the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa. One of the distinguishing features of the infraspinous fossa is these three lines or three ridges. These two fossas are connected via the supraglenoid notch, the spinoglenoid notch. You move towards the other end, which is the costal surface. It is convex, and this is making up a fossa, which is the subscapular fossa. This is the costal surface. Now we move towards the three angles, being the superior, inferior, and the lateral angle. Also, we see below the glenoid cavity is a tubercle, which is called as the infraglenoid tubercle at the lateral angle. It has three borders, being the lateral border, which is the thickest, medial border, and the superior border. The superior border follows all the way to the suprascapular notch. In the end, we go towards the three processes. This is the spinous process, the posterior part of which is called as the crest of the spine, following towards the acromion process. At the back end, we have the coronoid process. Now we move towards the attachments of these. As I said, in the attachments, we need to focus on three things, being the insertions, the origins, and the ligaments. So, when we talk about these insertions, these pictures would be rather more clear to you. So we talk about the dorsal aspect first, which is the dorsal aspect having a spinous process. The blue ones are the insertions in here, and the red ones are the origins in here. So, first of all, talk about the spinous process. The spinous process is divided into three borders and two surfaces. That is, two surfaces and three borders. Now we talk about the attachments regarding this one. First of all is the deltoid, which arises from the lateral border of the acromion and lower border of the crest of the spine. So this is the origin of the deltoid muscle, whereas at the other end is the insertion of the trapezius, which is inserted into the upper border of the crest of the spine and the medial border of the acromion. So the acromion had two borders, the medial and the lateral. At the lateral one, the deltoid arises. At the medial one, the trapezius inserts. This is the crest of the spine. This is the spinous process. Over here we have two borders, three borders and two surfaces, in which the deltoid arises from the lower border of the crest of the spine, going all the way towards the lateral border of the acromion process, whereas the medial border of the acromion process gives insertion to trapezius, following all the way towards the spinous process. Now we talked about the supra and the infraspinous fossa. The supraspinous fossa will give origin to the supraspinatus muscle. The infraspinous fossa will give origin to the infraspinatus muscle. Along the lateral border, we have origin of three muscles, being teres major, teres minor, teres major, and then latissimus dorsi. I repeat, at the lateral border, we have origin of three muscles, which is teres minor, and then we have teres major, Below teres major is latissimus dorsi. Moving towards the medial border, this will give attachment to the rhomboid major, the rhomboid minor, and the levator scapulae muscle. These were the attachments on the dorsal surface. I will repeat again. The dorsal surface was divided by the spinous process into two parts, making up the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa. These two were connected by the spinoglenoid notch. Now the attachments in the spinous process, there was attachment at the lower border of the origin of the deltoid muscle, moving all the way towards the lateral border. At the medial end of the acromion process, we had the insertion of the trapezius muscle going all the way towards the other border of the spine. So this was a deltoid, this was the trapezius. Now we move with the fossa. The supraspinous fossa had supraspinatus muscle. This had the infraspinatus muscle. At the lateral border, we had three muscles originating: teres minor, followed by teres major, and the lower end we had latissimus dorsi, whereas at the medial end there was a rhomboid major, followed by rhomboid minor, and then we had the levator scapula muscle. These were the attachments at the dorsal surface. Now moving on towards the costal surface. At the costal surface, as we said, we had the subscapular fossa. It gives origin to the subscapularis muscle. Alongside the subscapularis muscle, at the medial border, all the way down is the insertion, I repeat, insertion of the serratus anterior muscle. Now these were the significant muscular attachments. Now as we said over here, this was the glenoid cavity. Below the glenoid cavity is the infraglenoid notch. Now we have two muscles, that is the tricep brachii and the bicep brachii. The long head of the tricep brachii will arise from the infraglenoid tubercle, whereas the long head of the bicep brachii will arise from the supraglenoid tubercle. So we have a tubercle at the upper end and a tubercle at the lower end. This is supraglenoid tubercle, this is infraglenoid tubercle. The infraglenoid tubercle will give attachment to, or the origin to, the long head of the biceps, whereas the long head of the triceps. The supraglenoid will give attachment or origin to the bicep brachii's long head. Now as we've talked about the supra and the supraglenoid and the infraglenoid tubercle, the infraglenoid tubercle was giving origin to the long head of the tricep brachii, whereas the supraglenoid tubercle was giving origin to the long head of the bicep brachii muscle. Additionally, the short head of the bicep brachii muscle arises from the coronoid process, along with another muscle called as a coracobrachialis. Now we'll move with the ligament attachments. We'll talk about three ligaments. The coracoacromial ligament. The coracoacromial ligament is attached to the lateral border of the coracoacromial ligament. The lateral border is attached to the coracoid process and towards the tip of the acromion. I repeat, we talk about ligaments. We'll talk about three ligaments, being the coracoacromial ligament. The coracoacromial ligament arises from the lateral border of the coronoid process and from this tip of the acromion. The next we talk about is the coracohumeral ligament, which is attached at the root of the coracoid process. The third one is the spinoglenoid ligament, which covers the spinoglenoid notch or bridges the spinoglenoid notch.